Snow was still sliding off my shoulders when the house shifted just a breath, a tilt in the air, like the moment right before a line snaps on a pole. I heard the TV in the living room, the kids running down the hall. A warm, bright scene a man my age shouldn't take for granted. Then the blow landed. Uncle Harlan, why don't you ever put up Christmas lights? Not ever. The fork slipped from my hand before I felt my fingers open. Metal hit the plate, a sharp ring slicing the room clean in half. Conversations died mid-word. Chairs stopped moving. Every face turned toward me, except the one person who knew exactly why that question cut the way it did. Outside, the wind pushed hard against the old windows, rattling them like knuckles on a door I'd spent half my life refusing to answer. I lifted my eyes and saw Elliot watching me, waiting for a simple truth that had never been simple. And in that moment, with the smell of pine and turkey settling around us, I realized the past had just pulled up a chair at the table. The fork slid out of my hand before I understood what I was doing. It hit the rim of the plate and bounced once, that small metal sound cutting straight through the noise in Miriam's dining room. A moment earlier, the house had been full of voices and the low rumble of the game on the television in the living room. Kids had been laughing down the hall. Now it all thinned out, as if someone had put a hand over the speakers of the world. Elliot sat across from me, feet swinging under his chair, the red nose on his reindeer sweater blinking on and off as he breathed. The light from that silly little bulb flashed against his chin when he leaned forward. He was 9, and still at the age where he believed every question had a simple answer, if you waited politely for it. He had just asked why I never put up Christmas lights, why I never hosted the holiday. Not once. Not in all of his life. Miriam sat on his left. I watched her shoulders stiffen before she moved. Her hand drifted toward her wine glass, stopped in mid-air, then settled on the edge of the white tablecloth with the red stitching she only ironed for December. Her fingers pressed into the fabric until the knuckles blanched. She kept her eyes on her plate like there was something important hiding in the mashed potatoes. She did not want to look at me. That was answer enough for anyone paying attention. The room was warm in the way winter kitchens get warm. The oven had been going since early afternoon. The smell of roast turkey sweet potatoes with marshmallows and the sharp sweetness of canned cranberry sauce floated up from the table. A faint pine scent came from the real tree in the corner, the one the kids had covered in lopsided ornaments. The furnace kicked on under the floor, humming through the vents with a steady sound I knew well. I worked around heaters and transformers and vines for most of my life. The low vibration under my boots was as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. None of it reached the cold sitting just under my ribs. Outside, the wind pushed hard against the old windows. The glass rattled in their wooden frames. The ornaments on the tree chimed softly against one another, a thin clinking sound. Somewhere down the street, a snowplow scraped along the asphalt steel on ice, the engine rising and falling as it crawled past the house. Through the lace curtain, I could see the neighbor across the way, his roof traced in neat white lights. A plastic snowman glowing by his mailbox. My own house was 3 blocks away on the corner. I pictured it as clearly as if I were standing in the street. No lights, no wreath, just a dark outline against the snow. The hooks were still screwed into the eaves from the years when I used to string up lights before anyone else on the block. Back when Lydia and I were young, and I believed there was something almost holy about the way warm light hit fresh snow. People used to slow their cars as they passed and point to our place. "That house shines," they would say. "That one is ours." Now it was just another shape the plow passed without noticing. Elliot cleared his throat. The sound was small, but it felt loud. He shifted in his chair and leaned a little closer, elbows on the table, in a way Miriam usually corrected. This time she did not say a word. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, careful, like he sensed he was pushing on a bruise he could not see. He asked if I was afraid of something that happened back then. The question settled heavy in the middle of the table. Holiday dinners are not built to hold questions like that. I had heard grown men edge toward it over the years, at job sites, in break rooms, on cold mornings, when they asked why I always put my name down for Christmas overtime. I always had easy answers. Extra pay. Nothing much waiting for me at home. Not a holiday guy anymore. You can dodge something when it comes from people who do not know you beyond your name on a schedule. It is harder when it comes from a boy who has watched you sit alone at the corner of the table for as long as he can remember. My hands stayed flat on the table. Big hands darkened at the knuckles, scarred and ridged from years of climbing poles in freezing rain from wrestling lines, while the wind tried to peel me off them from turning rusted bolts with a wrench until my fingers cramped. There was still a faint line of grease under one thumbnail from a transformer we swapped out the day before. The cloth rasped lightly under my fingertips when I spread them, feeling the weave. It was a small thing to hold on to. The air in my chest felt thick. I did not have to think about the year he meant. 1999 sat in my memory like black ice, invisible until you were already on it. I had walked up to it 100 times in my head and stepped back every single time. The way the wind sounded against the siding tonight was a little too close to how it had sounded then. I let my gaze move slowly around the table. Miriam's husband stared down at his plate with the focused attention of a man inspecting concrete. One of the younger kids reached carefully for a dinner roll, eyes fixed on the bread, as if looking anywhere else might make something break. From the living room, the commentator on the television kept talking about yards and scores, but the sound had hollowed into a distant murmur. When I met Miriam's eyes at last, there was no anger in them, just a tired worry and something like resignation. She remembered that winter the way the bottom dropped out of our family. She remembered what I had turned into afterward. Her look was a quiet request. Please not here. Not in front of the kids. Not on Christmas Eve. For a moment I considered giving her that. I could have talked about bad knees and icy ladders, about not trusting my balance up near the gutters. I could have laughed it off, said a man my age had earned the right to leave his house dark and his evenings quiet. There are plenty of ways for a man to hide without looking like he is hiding. But last week in the garage, my boot had brushed that sagging cardboard box by the wall. The coils of wire inside had shifted bulbs clicking lightly against each other in the cold. I had not opened that box for 25 years. I knew exactly what was inside without needing to see it. I stepped around it the way I always did. And for the first time, the movement felt less like habit and more like cowardice. Sitting at that table with the smell of pine and turkey and cinnamon all around me, and the wind breathing at the windows, I realized I was tired. Tired of being the one dark house on the street. Tired of walking the long way around the same crack in the same ice every December. I looked back at Elliot. His sweater lights blinked softly in the dim room. His eyes were steady. He did not know what he was asking me to open. That was exactly what made it pure. All right, son. The words came out low. I felt Miriam close her eyes for just a heartbeat, then opened them again, bracing herself. I said I would tell him. I added that this was not the kind of story people usually told on a peaceful Christmas night. The sentence seemed to lay itself across the table and stay there. No one reached for a glass. No one made a joke. The furnace hummed under the floor. Outside, the wind shifted and slid around the corners of the house, catching the eaves in a way that made a faint old sound I had not heard in a very long time. For a second in that sound I could hear another house, another December, another night, when the world had gone just this quiet right before it split open. My right hand curled slightly on the tablecloth without my permission, fingers digging in, as if there were still a plate there, still a fork, still that first impact. The feeling passed, leaving only the warm room, the boy watching me, and the road back to 1999, waiting where I had left it. I took one more slow breath, and this time I did not look away. The furnace kept humming under the floor, a long, steady breath that matched my own as I sat at Miriam's table. Elliot waited without speaking, his small hands resting beside his plate. The lights on his sweater blinked in slow pulses, red, then dark, then red again. The wind brushed the windows once more, and in that thin sound, I felt the years pull me backward away from her warm kitchen and into a smaller house, a younger life, a man who still believed good years stayed that way. Back then, our world was a little wooden house on the edge of town in Ohio. One-story narrow porch paint, always one season behind what it should have been. The floorboards complained under every step, and I used to think of that noise as the house talking a kind of tired welcome when I came home late from a shift. Lydia would be near the front window in her soft chair, a book open in her lap, her legs tucked under her. The lamplight made a small circle in the room, and the rest of the house fell off into shadow. She worked part-time at City Hall, sitting behind a worn counter that had seen more signatures than either of us could count. She knew who was getting married, who was starting a business, who was arguing about property lines or dog licenses. In the evenings, she would tell me little bits about her day, never enough to break any rule, just enough to paint a picture of a town quietly turning on its own small troubles. She would walk in with the scent of dry paper and old air clinging to her coat, set her bag down, and lean against the counter while I rinsed my hands after a long day on the lines. My days were a different kind of work. Out in a truck that smelled of diesel and damp rope, climbing poles in the rain and snow, handling cables that could kill you if you forgot who they were for even half a second. There were nights when the cold went straight through the glove leather into my fingers, and I had to blow on my hands before I could even grip the next rung. I took pride in that life. When a storm passed and the lights in a neighborhood came back on, it felt like proof that what I did mattered. At home, I liked simple things. I liked the sound of Lydia turning pages, the way her brow furrowed when she read. I liked the way the lamp by the window made the glass look almost warm, when outside was nothing but empty darkness. Sometimes I would stand in the doorway and just watch her for a minute, boots still on hands, still stiff, and think to myself that this was enough. A woman I loved, a house that held our weight, work that paid the bills. It felt solid. It felt earned. We wanted children. We did not talk about it in big speeches or dramatic scenes. It was more in the way Lydia paused when we passed the baby clothes in a store, or the way she touched the doorframe of the small room down the hall that we only ever called the spare room. We tried. Time passed. Each month that came and went without change left a little more silence behind. One evening, she sat at the kitchen table with a pamphlet in front of her fingers, resting on the edge of it, as if the paper might cut. She said the doctor had mentioned adoption, said it gently like she did not want to make it a fight. I told her we were still young, that there was time that we could try again. She nodded, folded the pamphlet once, twice, then tucked it into her bag. She smiled like it was no big thing. But her shoulders dropped just a little, and her eyes went to the window instead of me. I told myself she was just tired from a long day behind that counter at City Hall, listening to other people's lives. It was easier than admitting I might have made her feel alone in something that was supposed to belong to both of us. Carter came in and out of that life like a stray bolt of weather you learn to live with. My younger brother could talk himself into almost anything, and out of almost nothing. Some weeks he was a mechanic, some weeks a bartender, some weeks between jobs with a shrug that turned failure into a joke. He would show up at our door with a six-pack under his arm, grin-wide eyes already scanning the room like he was taking inventory. Lydia would put on a pot of coffee, or pour him a glass of whatever we had. He called me the steady one, said it with half admiration and half something sharper. There were times when his chaos came in useful. One winter night, the old truck Lydia drove home from City Hall refused to start in the parking lot, engine coughing out cold air. I was out on a call. Carter happened to be nearby, dropping off a friend. He got her car running, followed her home to make sure it did not die on the way, then stayed to change out the battery in our driveway with his fingers turning red from the wind. Lydia told me later with real gratitude in her voice. For a while after that, when he knocked on the door, I heard that story before I remembered the borrowed money and broken promises. But small things kept piling up. Carter always seemed to know my shifts before I told him. He would say things like, "You're on nights the rest of this week, right?" Or "They got you on storm call again tomorrow," and I would nod, thinking he had just guessed. Once, though, he mentioned a specific overtime assignment I had picked up that same morning, something I had not told anyone at home. I asked how he knew. He laughed it off, said word traveled, said a guy at a bar had mentioned it. I did not think about how strange that was. I should have. The shifts in Lydia were smaller, quieter. She began spending more time at the window, even when there was nothing to see. Cars passed. Neighbors walked dogs. Snow caught the light from the street lamp across the road. Sometimes she stared so long the tea in her mug went cold. When I asked how work was, she would say busy in a flat tone that did not invite more questions. Once she mentioned a man who had come to her desk asking about property records for our part of town. He wanted to know who owned what along your street, she said, wiping her hands on a dish towel. I asked who he was. She hesitated a second too long. Just some guy, she answered finally. Some investor type. Passing through. Then she changed the subject. Asked about my day, pulled me away from the thought before it could take shape. At the time, I let it go. We were just another small house on a forgotten edge of town. Why would anyone be looking at us on a map? Christmas rolled around each year and wrapped all those small uneasinesses in warm lights and noise. I was always the first one on our street to hang the lights. Lydia would stand on the porch in her coat from City Hall, still smelling faintly of paper and copier toner, while I climbed the ladder and clipped strands along the eaves. She would tell me if one corner sagged or one stretch needed another loop. Even when there was sadness in her eyes, she still looked up at that house with a soft pride that made me feel like I had done something right. There is one night that keeps coming back to me now. I had just gotten home from a brutal shift, ice clinging to the cuffs of my work pants, hands stiff from the cold. The house was quiet. No music, no television, just the low buzz of the tree lights. Lydia stood by the front window in her blouse and skirt coat, still hanging over a chair, as if she had never fully come home from City Hall. Snow drifted down in heavy flakes outside, blurring the street lights. I said her name. She did not turn at first. Her hand was resting lightly on the window frame, fingers tapping a slow, uneven rhythm I had never noticed before. When she finally looked back at me, there was that familiar small smile, but behind it, something else. Something pulled tight and thin. I asked if everything was all right. She said she was just thinking. Long day, I nodded and let it go, like I had let so many small things go. Later that night, as I turned off the tree, I saw a slip of paper on the counter with a few words in her handwriting. A reminder to herself about forms to file in the morning. At the very bottom, in smaller letters almost scratched in, was our street name next to our own address circled once. I told myself she had just been organizing her thoughts after that man asked about our neighborhood. I flipped the paper over and left it there. Years later, I would remember that circle around our house like you remember a sound right before something breaks. At the time, it was just another piece of paper on a crowded counter in a life I was sure was still on solid ground. I remember the quiet at Miriam's table fading as I tried to form the next part of the story. My hands were still on the wood, fingers pressed into its grain, but my mind had already left her kitchen. It was moving back to a night when the world still looked familiar, right up until the moment it didn't. The afternoon shift that Christmas Eve had been rough. Wind picking up temperature, dropping fast, the kind of weather that makes every pole feel higher and every cable feel colder. I had packed for the long night ahead, poured coffee into the thermos, set the small box for Lydia beside me on the truck seat. It was nothing extravagant, just a bracelet with a pattern she once pointed at in a store window. I had planned to give it to her after midnight when I came back smelling of cold wind and diesel. Dispatch called just as the first flakes started to fall. Their voice cracked through static saying the storm path had shifted and my route was being reassigned. I pushed back out of habit, asked if they were sure, then settled when they confirmed. It was a holiday after all. A few extra hours at home sounded like a gift. I turned the truck around, watching the mirrored lights from storefronts flicker across the windshield. Houses glowed with strings of red and white bulbs. Kids ran across lawns, still unfrozen, their shouts trailing into the dark. Snow thickened as I moved down familiar streets, soft at first, then steady. Our block was quieter than most. By the time I pulled into the driveway, a thin coat of snow covered everything clean and smooth, except for the area around our porch. There the surface was broken, trampled by prints that did not belong to Lydia. They were larger, deeper, walking along the porch rail, stopping near the windows, circling like someone had taken their time just standing there. Snow had drifted over some of them, but not enough to hide how fresh they were. I sat in the truck longer than I should have, one hand on the small box, the other still resting on the key. The house looked almost too still. Only the living room lamp was on, shining through the curtain in a muted yellow shape. Usually that light was a welcome thing, a sign that Lydia was home reading or finishing paperwork from City Hall. That night it felt like something beating weakly under a blanket. When I finally stepped out, the air cut hard against my face. My breath made small clouds in front of me as I walked to the porch. The gift box slid a little in my gloved hand. I noticed the door and touched it lightly. It wasn't locked. We often forgot, but something about it felt wrong this time. A draft slipped out as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warmth of the house hit me first. Too warm, like someone had turned the thermostat higher than we ever did. Then the smell. Pine from the tree, yes, but underneath it, a heavy sweetness. Red wine, and another scent, thicker a perfume Lydia didn't own. She liked lighter fragrances, ones that disappeared unless you were close enough to hold her. This one carried itself across the room as if claiming space. I closed the door behind me without meaning to. My boots stayed on the mat while I listened. At first there was nothing but the low hum of the heater and the faint sound of a car somewhere out on the main road. Then her voice reached me. a whisper sharp around the edges, as if she was afraid the walls might hear. I could not make out the first part, only the end, and it hit me like a cold hand closing around the back of my neck. She said they had to finish something before the new year, or he would do something they could never take back. I moved down the hallway quietly, the box tucked under my arm now, so both hands were free. Light from the living room stretched thin across the floor. The smell of wine was stronger. I could hear a second voicemail, low and quick, too muffled to understand. My steps slowed. I passed the spot where we used to hang stockings, when holidays still felt like a future we were walking toward. When I reached the living room doorway, I stopped just short of it. The door was partly open. Through the narrow gap, I could see the corner of the coffee table and the soft glow of the tree lights blinking their slow rhythm. Something buzzed, then a quick vibration against wood. I leaned slightly to see the source. It was Carter's phone. Face up. Screen glowing soft in the dim light. His case was unmistakable, the old sports logo nearly rubbed off. Across the screen, an incoming call flashed with a name I had never seen before. Ronan Vale. Something about the name made my stomach pull tight the way a dog reacts before a storm. I didn't know him, but the sound of that name felt wrong. The phone stopped buzzing. The silence that followed slid heavy into the room. Lydia's voice came again. Closer. More desperate now, like she was trying not to let the tremble in her throat slip out. She said she couldn't do this anymore. She said she didn't want to keep lying. She said my name so quietly, it barely reached the doorway. I stepped back once, steadying myself with a hand on the wall. A part of me wanted to shout her name, make noise, give them a chance to step away from whatever I was about to see. Another part of me, the part worn down by too many small things ignored, needed to watch first, needed to understand. I pushed the door with my fingertips. It opened without a sound. The room looked familiar and wrong at the same time. The tree blinked in the corner. The couch sat angled toward the fireplace. Everything was as it always was, except for the tension hanging in the space between them. Papers were spread across the table in messy stacks. A wine bottle leaned against one pile, as if it had been pushed aside in a hurry. Lydia stood near the table with her shoulders drawn tight, hands hovering above the documents as if afraid to touch them, or afraid not to. Her face was pale, the kind of pale that comes from holding breath too long. Carter stood close enough to touch her one hand flat on the table, the other gripping a page as if it might keep the whole situation from falling apart. They didn't turn until the floor creaked under my boot. When they finally looked my way, their expressions weren't guilt or fear. They were something deeper, something like being caught under a weight they couldn't hold anymore. The gift box in my hand shifted its edges, digging into my palm. I didn't drop it, but it no longer felt like a thing meant for that night. All I could see were the papers on the table, the wine glasses, and the shadows thrown across their faces by the blinking lights. Whatever story had been unfolding in my home while I was out fighting storms, it was standing right in front of me now. And I knew the moment their eyes met mine that nothing in our life would return to the way it had been when I walked out that door earlier that day. The floor creaked under my boot, and that tiny sound seemed to snap the room into motion. The Christmas tree kept blinking in the corner, slow red and gold pulses sliding over their faces. Lydia stood by the coffee table with her shoulders drawn up tight, as if she were trying to make herself smaller. Carter was too close to her. One hand planted on the wood, the other gripping a sheet of paper hard enough to wrinkle it. The phone that had lit up with Ronan Vale sat dark now, but I felt it in the room, the way you feel a live wire before you touch it. I set the gift box down on the mantel without looking at it. I wanted both hands free. My chest was tight, not from fear of them, but from the way everything in front of me did not fit the life I thought I lived. I stepped toward the table. The papers were a mess, half stacked, half spread, and all of them stamped with Whitford Bank headers. Loan notices, refinance forms. A thick envelope on top, sealed heavy. The kind of envelope that does not carry good news. Carter spoke first. His voice came steady, almost polite, and that was the first thing that scared me about him. He asked why I was home so early, like my schedule was just another item he had already checked off. I did not answer. I reached for the envelope. Carter moved fast. Not angry fast. Panicked fast, dressed up as control. His hand slapped down over it, fingers spread wide, knuckles pale. His jaw worked once, and for a second his eyes flicked toward the front window, then back to me. It was the look of a man listening for footsteps he did not want to hear. Lydia shook her head hard, the way you shake off a nightmare. She said it was not what I thought. The words came out thin, rushed, like she was trying to beat something bigger to the air. But her eyes were locked on the phone beside the papers, not on me. Terror sat in them. Not guilt. Terror. I kept my voice low because something in the room told me volume was dangerous. I asked who the envelope was for. Carter swallowed. It was like watching him choke down a stone. He said it was already done. He said they were waiting. The word they landed heavy. He did not say a name, but that phone had already done it for him. I slid one paper out from under his hand. A refinance request. My name printed clean at the top. My address beneath it. And a signature at the bottom that looked like mine if you squinted but wasn't. The loops were too open, the pressure too even. Whoever signed it had practiced. I could feel the blood in my ears. I held the page up in the blinking tree light and looked at Carter. He lifted his hands slowly, open palms the way you show you are not holding a weapon. His fingers trembled anyway. There was sweat at his hairline, although the room was cold where I stood. He said he never meant for it to touch me. He said he was trying to keep a problem away from the family. The words were quick now, the calm breaking. Lydia stepped forward half a step. She did not reach for me. She kept her hands close to her chest, fingers curled like she was holding herself together. Her voice shook as she said they had run out of options. She said someone had demanded collateral. She said if they didn't do what they were told, things would get bad fast. I asked what kind of bad. She opened her mouth, then stopped. Her throat moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes went to Carter as if she was waiting for permission to speak. That alone told me more than any confession could. Carter rubbed his face with both hands, then dropped them to his sides like they were too heavy. He said Ronan did not like being stalled. He said Ronan had given them a deadline, New Year's. He added that this wasn't just about money, that Ronan had people in town, people who called people who showed up at night. He wasn't bragging. He was warning me. His voice cracked on the last word. The heater kicked on again, blowing warm air across the papers, lifting one corner like a nervous breath. The tree lights blinked, and the shadows of our three bodies shifted across the table. For a second, I saw my own silhouette, stretching over the documents like a man trying to cover a fire with his hands. I looked at Lydia. Her breathing was shallow. She kept glancing toward the hallway, then toward the window, not because she expected me to explode, but because she expected someone else to walk in at any second. I asked her why she had not told me the moment it started. Her face tightened. She said she was afraid. She said Carter told her Ronan would come after me if I knew. She said she believed she could fix it quietly before it reached our door. She did not say she had been wrong, but her eyes did. I turned back to Carter. I asked how he got mixed up with a man like Ronan. He stared at the floor for a long moment, then said it had started small. A bet. A favor. Then the numbers grew. Then the threats did. Then he was no longer dealing with a bookie, he was dealing with a man who didn't lose patience. He lost people. That word, people, made Lydia flinch like she had been slapped. My hands stayed steady on the paper, but inside me something was shaking loose. I heard every small warning from the years before, every time Carter had known my schedule too well, every time Lydia went quiet after a late call. All of it snapped into a shape I hated. I asked to see the rest. Carter hesitated, then slid another sheet toward me with the back of his hand, careful not to touch me. Loan consolidation. My property listed as security. A notice about default if payments weren't made by a date weeks away. The kind of date that matched what he had said. New Year's. I looked at the amount. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a few missed payments. This was a rope around the whole house. A sound came from outside then. Not loud. Just the slow crunch of tires over fresh snow. We all turned our heads at the same time. The headlights passed the window. Paused a beat too long at the curb, then rolled on. The quiet they left behind was worse than the sound. Carter's face went pale. He whispered that Ronan liked to remind people he could reach them any time. Lydia closed her eyes and pressed her palm to her mouth, holding back something that wanted to break through. I stepped to the window and pulled the curtain back an inch. The street was empty now, only the glow of neighbor lights and falling snow, but the hair on my arms didn't go down. The sense of being watched stayed. I turned back to them. I could feel the shape of the next choice forming in my chest. Anger wanted to take the wheel, but anger wouldn't protect anyone here. I asked them one question, slow and clear. Has he ever been inside this house? Neither one answered right away. Carter looked at Lydia. Lydia looked at the floor. That was an answer. My throat went dry. I nodded once more to myself than to them. Then I picked up the thick envelope again. Carter did not stop me this time. His hands shook at his sides. I broke the seal. Inside was a typed letter official enough to scare a man who didn't know better, but the language was wrong. Not bank language. Threat language dressed up in bank ink. A line jumped out at me because it didn't belong in any legal notice. If you try to involve anyone else, the price doubles, and so does the pain. My eyes lifted to Lydia. She saw my face and started to cry without sound, just tears running down her body locked in place. Carter's shoulders caved like he had been standing on borrowed strength the whole time. I folded the letter slowly and set it on the table between us. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows again, harder now, like someone leaning their weight on the glass. The tree blinked. The heater hummed. And in my own living room on Christmas Eve, I understood that this wasn't just betrayal. It was a countdown. And the clock had already started. Morning came gray and thin, the kind of winter dawn that does not feel like a new start, so much as a continuation of the same bad night. The tree lights were still blinking in the corner because none of us had the heart to turn them off. Each soft pulse slid across the walls like a slow warning. I had slept in fragments. Every time the heater clicked on, I heard that letter again in my head, the sentence about doubling the price and the pain. It did not read like a bank notice. It read like a man leaning close enough for you to smell his breath. Carter left before the sun was up. He said he had to take care of something, but his voice was flat, and he kept glancing toward the street as he pulled on his coat. I watched him from the hallway. His hands shook so hard he could not zip his jacket on the first try. When the door shut behind him, the house fell into a quiet that felt unnatural, like a line that had gone dead, but was still carrying current somewhere. Lydia sat on the couch with her knees tucked beneath her, a blanket pulled to her chin, even though the heat was running. Her eyes were open, fixed on nothing. I could not tell if she was trying to hold herself together or already gone somewhere I could not follow. I made coffee because my hands needed something to do. The machine sputtered and hissed. Normal sounds in a room that no longer knew what normal meant. By 8, I was in my truck and headed downtown. I did not tell Lydia I was going. She did not ask. We were both saving our voices for whatever came next. The streets were slushy and quiet, storefronts still dressed in Christmas garland, a bell ringer at the corner swinging his kettle in slow, tired arcs. Everything looked the way it always looked the day after Christmas. That made me angry for a reason I could not name. The world had no right to stay the same. Stephen Whitaker's office sat above the hardware store, 2 narrow flights that smelled like sawdust and cold metal. He met me at the door with his tie loosened, coffee in hand, and the look of a man who could already hear trouble coming up the stairs. I spread the Whitford bank papers on his desk. He read in silence for a long time, brow tightening as he moved through each page. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful. He said the refinance was real. The filing had already gone through. The signature was not mine, but whoever forged it knew what they were doing. He pointed to the notary stamp and a line in the margin listing the filing agent, a woman named Marla Givens. I told him I had never heard that name. Stephen nodded once. He said she was tied to a shell company the FBI had been watching quietly, a small cog in a larger machine. He said this was not some desperate paperwork trick from a guy in a bar. This was organized and clean. I asked how a forged refinance made it past the notary process. Stephen didn't blink. He said there were ways. Remote notarization was starting to spread even then. IDs could be copied. Notaries could be leaned on or bought. A fraud like this did not happen unless someone had planned it and paid for it. He slid the papers back toward me and said the bank would not care about any of that unless we brought proof fast. On paper, the house was collateral. On paper, I had agreed. The law follows ink. He said we needed to file a fraud claim immediately. He said we needed to talk to law enforcement, but only if someone was willing to put Ronan Vale's name in a report. He asked if Lydia would testify that she had been coerced. I didn't answer right away. I was still seeing her face from last night, the way her eyes kept drifting to the dark phone on the table. Stephen looked at me with the patience of a man who had learned not to push too hard. He said fear like that does not come from money alone. When I stepped back onto the street, the cold hit harder than before. I sat in my truck for a full minute without turning the key, hands tight on the wheel. I wanted to drive straight to Whitford Bank and demand answers. I wanted to find Ronan with my fists. I knew neither impulse would fix a damn thing. Stephen was right. This was a paper war now. And paper wars don't care about what a man wants. Carter's truck was in the driveway when I got home. He was standing in the kitchen with his hat still on. Eyes red face, drawn tight. Lydia sat at the table with a mug in front of her untouched. The coffee pot on the counter had burned down to a bitter smell. I set Stephen's card next to it. I told Carter the refinance was already done. I told him the signature was sophisticated. I told him we were on a clock with New Year's sitting like a blade at the end of it. His shoulders sagged, and whatever pride he had left slipped right out of him. He said he had tried to pay Ronan back once. He said it started with cards and sports bets, stupid numbers he thought he could cover. He lost. He borrowed to cover it. He lost again. The debt turned from something he could hide into a thing that followed him through doors. I asked how much. He gave me a number that made my stomach go cold. 6 figures. Not a spiral that ends with a lecture, a spiral that ends with a house. Lydia spoke before I could. Her voice was thin. She said she had been drugged. The word came out like it hurt to say. Her eyes were on the tabletop. She kept rubbing her thumb against her ring, as if the metal might anchor her. She tried to tell it straight, but it wouldn't come straight. She paused. She started again. She said there had been a small holiday party for City Hall staff. She had stayed late to finish filing permit renewals because the office would be closed for a few days. Carter had called her afterward, said he needed to talk, said he was scared. She met him at a bar near the courthouse. She remembered a drink in front of her. She remembered Carter's voice getting farther away as the room tilted. She remembered his hand guiding her out through the cold and into her own kitchen. Then pieces went missing. Her fingers shook harder now. She said she woke up at home with a pounding head and a taste of chemicals in her mouth. She found forms on the counter that she didn't remember signing. Her name was on them. Her handwriting was there, but it did not feel like hers. Carter was sitting at the table crying, saying he was sorry, saying Ronan had given him no choice. She said she wanted to go to me that night. Carter begged her not to. He told her Ronan would come for me if I found out. He told her the safest thing was to fix it quietly before it reached the family. She stopped there, breath shallow. Eyes wet, but not spilling. I could see shame in her face now, not because she had done something wrong, but because she had been made part of something filthy without her consent. Carter stared at the floor. His jaw clenched and unclenched like he was chewing on the guilt. I asked Lydia why she hadn't told me even after the first threat. She looked up at me for the first time that morning. Her eyes were raw and steady. She said she was afraid of what I would do. She said I was a man who climbed poles in storms and came home proud of fixing what was broken. Ronan knew that. Carter knew that. She thought if you lit a fuse in me, someone would die. She said she could not carry that risk, not with Ronan already circling our house. The word circling made me think of those boot prints on the porch. I felt a slow burn behind my ribs, anger mixed with something like grief. I had walked into that living room believing I was looking at betrayal. Now, I was seeing a brother drowning and a wife trapped between love and fear. The difference should have softened the pain. It didn't. It only changed its shape. I asked if there was anything, any detail that connected Ronan directly to the filings. Any name on a form. Any witness. Any place he had met her. Lydia went still. Her hand moved to her stomach without her realizing. She took a breath, started to speak, then stopped. Her throat worked. Harlan, she said, almost like she was asking permission to say the rest. I'm pregnant. The room stopped. Carter's head lifted fast, eyes wide. My body froze where I stood. Years of wanting, years of disappointment, the spare room down the hall, sitting empty, season after season, all of it crashed into that one sentence. I watched Lydia's face and knew she was telling the truth. Terror sat beside a spark of wonder she couldn't protect anymore. The tree lights blinked again. One bulb near the top flickered twice, then steadied. I heard myself breathe slow and broken. A child was the thing we had prayed for in quiet ways. Now it was another thread Ronan could pull if he wanted. I looked from Lydia to Carter and felt the shape of the fight ahead. It wasn't just my house on the line now. It was everything that had ever mattered in it. The sentence Lydia had just spoken hung in the air like smoke, that wouldn't clear even with the heater pushing warm air through the vents. I stood where I was looking at her hand on her stomach, looking at Carter's face turned tight with dread, and trying to find a place inside me that could hold what I was hearing. For years we had lived with the spare room down the hall like a quiet dare. Now there was life growing in her, and the first feeling that rose in me wasn't joy. It was arithmetic. I didn't say it out loud at first. I didn't have to. The calendar was pinned in my head the way dispatch schedules are, because my life had always been built on shifts, storms, and days counted by kerosene light in a bucket truck. I knew when I had been home. I knew when I hadn't. I saw the weeks stack up like poles on a roadside. The child couldn't be mine. I felt my tongue go dry. The tree blinked again, low and steady, and the room seemed to tilt a fraction, the way it does when your boot finds black ice. Lydia watched me read it on my face. She didn't flinch. She just lowered her eyes, as if she had been waiting for the moment the math would land. I asked her quietly when. Not how. Not who. Just when. She stared at her mug, then at her hands, then at the window, as if there might be an answer out there in the falling snow. When she finally spoke, the words didn't come in a clean line. They came in pieces like she was lifting stones one by one off a grave. She said it was after that City Hall party the same night she had already told me about, but not the part she could say while I was still holding on to a hope that the baby might somehow be ours. She said she had walked out into the cold, half dizzy from the drink, half dizzy from the long day. She said Carter was outside waiting, worried rushing her toward the car. She remembered lights in the parking lot blurring, remembered voices, a hand on her elbow guiding her. Then the memory broke apart. She only knew she woke later with bruises she couldn't explain, and a fear that didn't feel like a hangover. She stopped there, breathing shallow. Her fingers curled into the blanket on her lap until the fabric twisted. The silence after her words was worse than the words. I could feel my throat closing, my chest tightening a pressure that made my ribs ache. I asked who did it. She shook her head once, slow. She didn't want to see the man's face again, even in speech. Then she said his name anyway, the way you say something you wish didn't exist. A man who did maintenance jobs around town, a subcontractor who drifted through holiday gatherings because Ronan liked to put his people where decent families gathered. Lydia said she had seen him at a couple local events before a familiar stranger who smiled too long and watched too hard. Ronan had introduced him once as someone who took care of problems. She didn't understand what that meant until afterward. The house felt smaller with every sentence. I kept my eyes on her, trying not to look at Carter because I already knew what his face would show. I asked if she had gone to the police. She hesitated. Her breath caught. She said she tried. She had gone to the station 2 days later, still shaking, still unsure if she would make it through the door without turning back. She said someone took her statement. She said she was told they would follow up. Then the follow-up never came. A week later, Carter told her Ronan knew she had tried. Ronan said next time she opened her mouth, I would be the one paying for it. When she said my name in that sentence, something inside me split clean. I had always believed my job was to protect the people under my roof, to keep the lights on, to keep the doors locked against whatever the world carried in the dark. Hearing that she had been hurt and then forced into silence so I wouldn't go after the man, it made me feel like a husband who had been asleep on watch. I turned to Carter then. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The look on my face did the work. He started talking before I asked. Words rushed out of him like he'd been holding his breath for weeks. He said he knew about the assault almost right away. He said Lydia came to him first because she was terrified of what I would do if she told me. He said he promised to help her. Then Ronan cornered him with the debt, with the deadline, with a threat that had teeth. Carter's mouth trembled when he said the man's name. He said Ronan made it clear that if Lydia spoke again, if I found out, the punishment wouldn't stop at him. Carter looked like he hated himself for breathing by the time he finished. I asked him why he didn't come to me anyway, why he didn't let me decide what risk to take for my own family. He didn't have an answer big enough. He just looked down and said he thought he could fix it. He thought if he kept Ronan fed with money and paper, the darkness wouldn't reach my door. He said he used Lydia's fear and shame like a lever, and he knew it. The words sounded like they scraped his throat raw on the way out. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to drag him outside into the snow and make him look at the house he had used as collateral. But the anger that rose in me hit another wall right behind it. Lydia was sitting there shaking, carrying a child that wasn't mine, and she had already survived something that could have killed her spirit. If I exploded now, I would be turning the knife again. So I stepped back. I picked up my coat from the chair by the door. The movement surprised them both. It surprised me. The coat was heavy in my hand, familiar, the same one I wore up poles in storms. I stood with it half up my arm and felt like my body was waiting for me to choose. Walking out would have been the clean choice for my pride. A man who learns this kind of thing is allowed to leave. He is allowed to say the betrayal is too much, the shame too deep, the life too broken. I could have driven until the town fell behind me, found a motel off the highway called Stephen, filed for divorce, let the house go down in flames if that was what it took to cut the rope. Staying meant swallowing a pain I didn't know how to carry. It meant looking at Lydia every day and seeing the night she could barely speak about. It meant stepping into a father's role for a child who had come into the world through violence. It meant keeping Carter alive long enough to deal with Ronan, even though part of me wanted to let my brother drown in what he'd done. Neither choice felt like honor. Both felt like loss. Lydia began apologizing, not with drama, not with pleas, but with a low, exhausted stream that broke apart as her voice failed. She said she never wanted the truth to reach me through pain. She said she loved me. She said she was sorry for being afraid of my anger, sorry for trusting Carter to protect her, sorry for letting our home become a battlefield without telling me there was a war. I held the coat in my hand and listened. The heater clicked off. The room settled into a quiet so deep I could hear the faint tick of the clock over the mantel. Carter looked ready to fold in half. I could see the boy I used to drag along to fishing trips inside that broken man, and it made my anger feel complicated in a way I hated. I put the coat back on the chair, not because I was certain, not because I was forgiving anything yet. I did it because leaving right then would have been another kind of violence, and Lydia had already had enough of that for one lifetime. I told them we were going to handle Ronan the right way. Paper first. Police next. And if Ronan came through our door, then I would deal with him in the only language he respected. I said it without flourish, just a fact. Carter nodded fast. Lydia stared at me like she didn't know whether to believe relief was still allowed in her body. The tree blinked on. Off. On again. The same quiet rhythm that had watched us open gifts in better years was watching us split apart in this one. That night I went into the spare room alone. I stood in the doorway and looked at the empty walls. I tried to picture a crib. I tried to picture a child's laugh. The images came, but they didn't fit cleanly over what I knew now. I felt divided down the middle, betrayal on one side, helplessness on the other. And I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. Whatever I chose from here on out there was no version of this story that would leave me whole again. I left the spare room door open. When I walked back down the hall, like I was afraid closing it would lock some truth inside with me. The house was quiet, in that uneasy way it gets after a storm passes, when you know the lines are still loaded, but nobody is talking. Lydia had finally drifted off on the couch, one hand resting on her stomach, as if she was keeping watch even in sleep. Carter sat at the kitchen table with his shoulders rounded forward, palms flat on the wood, like he was trying to feel for steadiness through it. Sometime after 2, his phone lit up again. The vibration was small, but it cut through the room. Carter flinched hard enough to knock his chair back an inch. He stared at the screen like it was a live thing. Then he answered voice-thin, trying to make it sound normal. The voice on the other end was low and even. I could hear it without hearing the words. Not loud, not angry. The kind of voice that doesn't need to raise itself because it already owns the room it's in. Carter gave a couple yeses, then a quiet, "I understand." When he hung up, his hands were shaking. He said Ronan wanted to see me. Tonight. He named a bar off Route 9, the one that sat out past the county line where the fields dropped into dark. A place men went when they didn't want to be recognized. I told him I was going alone. Carter started to protest, and stopped like he knew he had no standing left. Lydia was awake now, sitting up, hair fallen loose around her face. She didn't plead. She didn't argue. She just looked at me with a fear that was more tired than frantic, and she said, "Be careful," in a voice that sounded like prayer. I drove out under a sky the color of old steel. The roads were empty except for plow tracks, and the occasional pickup with a tree tied down in the bed. The farther I went, the quieter it got, like the town was already behind glass. The bar's sign flickered half its letters blue neon, fighting the cold. The gravel lot was mostly empty. One black sedan sat near the side entrance, clean enough to look like it had never seen a dirt road. Inside, the air smelled of stale smoke and fried food that had soaked into the walls. A small radio played a Christmas song, low the melody, thin and sad in a place like that. 2 men sat at the counter nursing beers. They glanced up and went back to their glasses. The bartender wiped the same spot on the bar over and over, eyes dull from too many nights like this. Ronan was in a booth at the back, his shoulders turned slightly so he could see the door without seeming to. He was dressed like he belonged somewhere better. Dark coat, clean collar, no flash. A man who could walk into a city fundraiser and into a roadside bar and never look out of place in either. He stood when I reached the booth, not as a show of respect, more like a ritual. His handshake was cool, firm, measured. His eyes held mine for a beat too long, taking inventory. Then he slid back into the seat with his back to the wall. I sat across from him, keeping my own shoulders square. My hands stayed on my thighs where I could feel their tension instead of hiding it. He didn't start with threats. He started with weather. Said the snow had come early this year. Said storms made honest work harder. He knew what I did for a living, and the way he said it let me know he'd known it longer than I was comfortable with. Then he let the small talk fall away, as if it had served its purpose. He said Carter's debt was one small piece of a larger business. He said people in town enjoyed the results of that business without asking questions. He said questions didn't help anyone. His voice stayed gentle, almost bored, like he was explaining a billing error to someone he expected to comply. I told him I wasn't there to learn about his business. I told him I was there to get my house back from under his hand and to keep Lydia safe. I said I would pay Carter's debt in full if he left her alone and undid the refinance. Ronan listened without blinking. When I finished, a faint smile touched one corner of his mouth, not amused, more like indulgent. He said money wasn't what he wanted from me. Money was everywhere. Men like Carter brought him money even when they didn't have it. He said what he wanted from me was silence. He used my last name again, easy and familiar, and I felt that cold line settle in my gut. Silence about what I asked. He looked down at his bottle, rotated it once by the neck, then looked back up. He said about what happened in your house, about what happened to your wife, about who has been helping you in that little lawyer's office, about anything you might be tempted to tell the police. He spoke like there was no emotion in it, but every word landed where it was meant to. I felt my jaw tighten. I asked him if he was the one who sent that man to the City Hall party. He didn't answer the question directly. He said people had jobs. People did favors. People made mistakes and needed someone to clean them up. Then he leaned forward, a little voice, dropping just enough to make me lean without wanting to. He said, "You're an honorable man, Harlan. That kind of man values family over pride." He said it like he had studied me in a file. I didn't flinch, but my hands curled into fists beneath the table. I told him he didn't know a damn thing about honor. He nodded, as if he had expected that line. Then he said calmly that a man who cared about honor doesn't send his pregnant wife into panic. He let that word sit there, pregnant, like a match left on the table. He didn't smirk. He didn't need to. He just watched to see what it did to me. Something inside me recoiled, not loud, not visible, but sharp. The fact that he knew about the baby meant he had eyes in my home, or in my brother, or in my wife's workplace. Maybe all three. I kept my face steady, but the booth felt smaller. He said my part was simple. Keep the family quiet. Don't file fraud claims. Don't talk to federal agents if they come sniffing around. Don't go digging for names connected to that night because digging would bring heat, and heat makes accidents happen. He didn't say accident like a threat. He said it like a forecast. I asked him what he would do if I didn't stay quiet. He took a slow sip and set the bottle down with care. He said he had no interest in trouble. Trouble cost money and attention. He said he preferred arrangements. He said if I cooperated, Carter's debt would stop growing, the refinance could be unwound later, and my wife could finish her pregnancy without any more fear. If I didn't, he said then the debt would double, and my house would be the least of what I lost. Still no raised voice. No slam on the table. Just a man stating terms like a banker. I asked him why he was doing this. Why my family? He shrugged slightly. He said your brother came to me. Your wife works in a place where paper moves easy. Your schedule is public enough if you know who to ask. He said all of that like it was weather too. Just conditions a smart man uses. He slid a folded sheet toward me, 2 fingers pushing it across the table without hurry. Dates, amounts, a payment schedule, and at the bottom a figure that looked less like debt and more like ransom. I didn't touch it. I read it where it lay. Rage rose up and met fear head-on inside me. I thought of Lydia asleep with her hand on her stomach. I thought of the spare room and how empty it still was. I thought of Carter's face when that car lingered outside our house. I knew Ronan was betting I'd choose the path that kept them breathing. So I breathed and did not move. I told him I needed time. He nodded once, slow, satisfied. He said New Year's comes fast. He said he appreciated men who kept matters private. Then he sat back, eyes softening in a way that was almost kind, until you realized kindness wasn't part of his vocabulary. When I stood to leave, he stood with me. He said, "Drive safe like a neighbor seeing you off." He said we would speak again soon. His smile stayed faint, neat, controlled. Outside, the cold air hit me clean and hard. I walked to my truck feeling like I'd stepped out of a room where the oxygen had been measured. I sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, staring at my breath, fogging the glass. The bar window glowed behind me in the mirror, and I could see his silhouette still seated in that booth, steady as a fixed point. I didn't know that the place had been wired for federal investigations. I didn't know my voice had just been caught by a microphone that had been waiting for Ronan long before it ever heard me. All I knew was I had walked in a husband and walked out a man holding a silence that felt like poison. When I got home, dawn was beginning to thin the dark. Lydia was waiting in the living room robe, pulled tight, eyes searching my face. Carter stood behind her, hollowed out. I told them Ronan wanted silence. I told them he knew about the baby. I didn't tell them what that did to me because I couldn't afford to break in front of them. In the weeks that followed, the calls kept coming through Carter. The pressure stayed gentle on the surface and brutal underneath. Stephen drew up divorce papers as a shield, a distance I told myself would keep Lydia safer and cut Ronan's leverage. I signed them with a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else. That night in the booth became a closed door in my mind. I didn't know it had been recorded. I didn't know it would surface decades later like a ghost with teeth. I only knew I had swallowed my pride to protect my family, and I had no idea yet what that silence was going to cost. After everything with Ronan, the lawyers, and the divorce filings, the world did not collapse the way I expected. It just fell quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in your bones and makes ordinary sounds feel sharper. When I moved into a cramped apartment outside Dayton, the first winter came fast. Snow stacked against the stairwell, the wind screamed under the siding, and the radiator knocked like it was trying to speak. I worked double shifts, came home sore, and held on to the hope that distance might finally shrink what had happened. Instead, a card showed up at my door. It was simple, the kind you buy by the dozen at a grocery store. My name written in shaky ink, no return address. When I opened it, the room seemed to tilt. 3 short lines, uneven, like someone's hand was trembling as they wrote, telling me they were sorry, telling me they hoped I was still alive, telling me they understood if I never forgave them. No name, no hint. Just remorse folded into cheap paper. I stood in that kitchen while the radiator clicked and the upstairs neighbor's TV bled through the ceiling. I read the lines again and again until my eyes blurred. Then I folded the card and slipped it into the drawer under the sink, the place where I stored sponges, old batteries, and things I never wanted to look at. I told myself I would forget it was there. But the drawer remembered. The next December, another card came. Different paper, same feeling crawling up my spine before I even opened it. Again, the writing looked just close enough to Lydia's that my chest tightened. Again, only a handful of words that carried more weight than a letter ever should. I put that one in the drawer, too. Closed it. Walked out. Pretended my pulse wasn't shaking. Then the years began to stack the way the snow did outside my windows. 20 winters of them. 20 cards that found me no matter where I moved. Dayton, then Indianapolis, then a duplex nearer the county line. I never told strangers where I lived. I kept my address off anything unnecessary. I avoided social media. Only Miriam, Stephen, and the company payroll knew where to send mail. Yet every December, a card arrived within a week of my move, as if someone saw each forwarding notice the moment it hit the postal system. I never threw them away. I never pinned them up. I only hid them because hiding them felt easier than deciding what kind of man their writer wanted me to be. Some years the handwriting was undeniably Lydia's, those soft loops she used to leave on grocery lists. She taped to our fridge. Some years it was jagged, rushed like Carter's hand when he signed a check, or wrote a birthday note 5 minutes before guests arrived. Other years it was neither. A stranger's apology. A stranger's plea. Those were the ones that unsettled me most. I would come home late from a shift, hands numb from winter work, and find an envelope slipped through the slot in my door. I would hold it without opening it, staring at the Christmas tree, blinking in the neighbor's window across the street, wondering how a man's life could narrow to a single moment from 1999 and never widen again. The silence did not break, but it grew louder. One December, 3 days before Christmas, Miriam visited. She brought a tin of cookies wrapped in red plastic and asked if I had plans for the holiday. We sat in my kitchen at a table barely big enough for 2 plates. She talked in that careful way siblings talk when they know there are entire rooms of conversation they cannot enter. I excused myself to grab a towel from under the sink, opened the drawer, and before I could shut it, she saw the stack of cards tucked behind the cleaning supplies. She did not say anything. She just froze for a heartbeat. Then a strange guilt flickered across her face, like she had been carrying a secret she thought was safe, until the moment she saw its shape in my drawer. I closed it slowly, and we went back to the table, pretending nothing had happened. For years, I told myself the cards meant nothing, that they were just echoes of mistakes I could not fix. But the truth is, they tethered me. Even when I tried to ignore them, they anchored me to a past that had no interest in loosening its grip. Then, last December arrived. Snow had started early that year, making everything feel quieter than usual. Work slowed down because the county had upgraded half the lines, so outages were fewer. I came home late one evening, the sky already black, my breath hanging in the air as I climbed the stairs. A single envelope lay against my door, caught by the wind, but held in place by the mat. The handwriting on it stopped me cold. It was Lydia's. Not the softened, shaky version that had appeared in some of the cards. Not the jagged lines I suspected were Carter's. This was the writing I had memorized years ago, the one she used when signing City Hall intake forms, steady and careful, a little shy around the corners of the letters. I brought the envelope inside and sat down at the table. I did not turn on the TV. I did not take off my coat. I opened it with the same feeling a man has when he touches something fragile from a former life. Inside was a photocopied ultrasound. Grainy. Faded. The date barely visible in the corner. And at the bottom, written in a faint, trembling line, were 2 words that pulled the air out of the room. Baby Avery. My name. I gripped the edges until the paper bent. It was not an original print. Someone had kept the real one. Someone had guarded it for years. Someone wanted me to see this version now because it was safer than sending the real thing. The refrigerator hummed behind me. The snow against the window made a soft, shushing sound. For a long time, I did not move. I stared at that small blur of a life that had been pushed into the shadows of my past without ever being given a chance to belong to anything. The cards no longer felt like apologies. They felt like breadcrumbs. Someone had been keeping track of me. Someone had been waiting for the right moment. Someone knew more than I did about a child whose image now sat trembling in my hands. I gathered every card from the drawer and spread them on the kitchen table. Years of ink, years of regret, years of fear wrapped in seasonal greetings. The handwriting changed. The tone shifted. The location stamps hopped across states. But one thing stayed consistent. The truth had never gone away. It had only been waiting for me to stop running. And as I stared at that photocopied ultrasound, I felt something shift, quiet, but undeniable, like a window cracking open in a winter storm. Someone out there had never left this story, and they were still watching. I was still holding the ultrasound copy when the phone rang. It was late enough that the house had gone completely still, the kind of silence that feels heavy when you have too many memories sitting close to the surface. I let it ring once, twice, almost a third time. Something in my chest tightened the way it used to whenever trouble came looking for my family. I picked it up. A thin breath dragged across the line before I heard my name, not spoken clearly, more like exhaled. It was Carter. His voice sounded flattened, buried under machines I could faintly hear in the background. A steady beep, the shuffle of rubber soles, a door closing softly. He said he was in a hospital somewhere outside Fort Wayne. He said he didn't have much time. For a moment, I couldn't pull a single word out of myself. I had imagined this call in a dozen ways over the years, but none of them involved him sounding like a man already halfway gone. My hand tightened on the edge of the kitchen counter, and I slid slowly into the chair, as if gravity had changed. He apologized first. Not with full sentences, just broken pieces of breath. I heard the effort in every sound he made. Then he said something that froze me still. Not all the Christmas cards were from him, and not all of them were from Lydia either. Someone else had been trying to reach me. I asked who. There was a long scrape of air as if he were turning his head away from the phone. He said he didn't know. He only knew it wasn't him. I pressed my thumb on the ultrasound, feeling the cheap toner smear slightly. I asked him why he was calling now, after all the years, after all the chances he had to come clean. His answer was barely more than a whisper, because the truth wouldn't let him die quiet. Another beep echoed behind him, slower than before. I imagined tubes, an IV line taped to his arm, a television muttering low, somewhere at the foot of the bed. Then he told me the part that cracked something open inside me, something I had tried to weld shut for half my life. He said the night I came home early in 1999 wasn't luck. It wasn't the storm changing my shift or a supervisor trying to help me get home for the holidays. Ronan had arranged it. Ronan had made sure I walked into that house at an exact time. Not earlier. Not later. A moment chosen for a reason I was never supposed to find out. I felt my breath slow in my chest. I asked him how Ronan could have done that. Carter swallowed hard and said one name I recognized from Lydia's old stories. A co-worker from her charity drives someone I had shaken hands with more times than I could remember. A man who later turned out to be one of Ronan's errand boys. Someone with enough access to know who assigned shifts and who could be leaned on quietly. It made sense in a sick way. Looking back, the pieces clicked together so cleanly I felt stupid for never seeing the shape they formed. The muffled conversations, the way Lydia kept locking the bathroom door, the silence between her and Carter whenever I walked into a room. I asked him why Ronan needed me to be there. There was a long pause. A nurse spoke somewhere in the distance, asking if he needed more pain control. He said no. I heard the tremor as he tried to keep the phone close. He finally said it. Because I wasn't supposed to witness what happened before I got home. Someone else was in my house that night. Someone who left before I stepped through the door. Someone tied to the assault Lydia had reported. Someone the police should have found if the report hadn't been buried. That made me sit up. I felt a heat rise behind my eyes, not anger exactly, more like disbelief, sharpening into something harder. I asked him what he meant by buried. He took a breath that sounded like it hurt. Lydia had filed right after it happened. She went to a local precinct with bruises she tried to hide with makeup. She talked to an officer she trusted, someone who had known her since she was a teenager. And 2 days later, the report vanished. I let that settle inside me. Years of doubt, shame, confusion, all reshaping themselves into a truth that had been stolen before any of us had a chance to face it. Then, Carter's voice changed. It cracked the way metal bends before it snaps. He said there was one more thing I didn't know. Something he had been carrying since the winter after the assault. He said it quietly, almost as if saying it out loud might make the walls hear him. It was about the fire. That word sat in the air between us. Fire. It felt heavy, wrong, familiar in a way I couldn't place. I asked him what fire he was talking about. He didn't answer right away. I heard the bed shift under him, the rustle of sheets. Then he said he had seen something years ago, something he should have reported, something connected to a building that burned the year after everything happened. Someone inside that building had died. Someone connected to Ronan. And Carter knew the flames weren't an accident. He whispered that he wasn't saying it to clear his name. He said guilt had chewed him hollow long before the cancer did. He only wanted me to know that the past didn't die clean. It burned and left pieces everywhere. The line went quiet, except for the machines. I realized he was waiting for me to speak, but I didn't know how. I finally said I was coming. Indiana wasn't far if I drove through the night. He took a breath so thin I almost missed it. He said I should hurry. Not because he wanted forgiveness, because there was something he needed to give me before he slipped away. I ended the call and sat in the dark kitchen for a long moment. The ultrasound lay on the table under the weak glow of the stove light. Snow tapped lightly on the window like fingertips. Somewhere in the house, the heater kicked on with a low groan. I grabbed my coat keys and the folder of cards I had pretended not to care about for years. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me square in the chest, waking up something I had kept buried. Driving into that night, I felt it clearly for the first time. The past wasn't done with me. And whatever waited in Indiana was going to change everything I thought I knew about Lydia, about Carter, and about the man who set all of this in motion. The hospital smelled like bleach and burnt coffee, the kind that sits too long on a warmer. A Christmas wreath hung crooked in the hallway. Plastic pine needles catching the glare of fluorescent lights. Somewhere down the corridor, a TV played softly behind a curtain, a game show laugh track, trying too hard to sound alive. Carter's room was dimmer than the rest, one small lamp by the window, the blinds half closed against the snow drifting past the parking lot. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not just thinner. Smaller in the bones. His skin had that drawn tightness sickness brings, and his breath came in shallow pulls that made his chest rise like he was climbing a hill no one else could see. A tube ran under his nose. The monitor beside him chirped in a steady rhythm, a reminder that time was being counted in numbers now. He waited until the nurse stepped out and the door clicked shut. Then he reached toward the nightstand with a hand that shook. He set a small USB drive on the blanket between us. For a second, he couldn't meet my eyes. He said, "She left this for you." He had to pause after the word left chest working. He swallowed like it hurt. I didn't move right away. That little piece of plastic felt heavier than anything on the bed. I watched his fingers curl and uncurl against the blanket, and I could see the fear in him, not of me, but of what the truth might do once it had air. I told him I was listening. He nodded once, then closed his eyes like he was trying to steady himself. The laptop the hospital kept for patients was old and slow, its fan whining the moment I plugged in the drive. The screen glowed blue in the dim room. I clicked the file. For a breath, nothing happened. Then Lydia's voice filled the space. It was thin and careful, as if she had recorded it with her mouth close to a wall and her ear turned to the door. I could hear the faint hum of a heater in the background, a car passing outside, and once the soft creak of a floorboard that made her stop breathing for a second before she went on. She sounded like a woman hiding in plain sight. She said she was making the recording because she didn't know if she would make it through the winter. She said Ronan's people had started showing up closer, watching longer, and she had run out of safe places to talk. She said she was staying at a friend's house for a few nights, a woman from church who didn't ask questions. Lydia apologized for the secrecy, then said secrecy was the only thing keeping her alive. I felt my grip tighten on the edge of the laptop. Carter's breathing grew ragged beside me. Lydia talked about the assault in a way that cut without describing. She said she had been cornered after that city hall party handed off to a man Ronan trusted to do dirty work. She said she had tried to go home before anyone noticed she was gone. She never said the man's name. She didn't have to. The fear in her voice carried it. She said she went to the police 2 days later. She described the cold plastic chair the front desk officer, who avoided her eyes the way her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She said she made a report and signed it. Then she said the report disappeared. She said she called twice and was told there was no file. She said an officer she recognized from our town, a man who used to smile at holiday parades, told her quietly to stop asking if she wanted her husband to stay alive. Hearing that made something in my chest turn hard. I stared at the screen, watching Lydia's audio wave crawl forward like a heartbeat. She said she tried to ask for help again. She went to Miriam because Miriam was the one person in the family she trusted besides me, the one person who always seemed to know what to do when the world got ugly. Lydia said she came into Miriam's kitchen shaking, trying to speak in fragments because fear strangled full sentences. Miriam misunderstood her. She thought Lydia was confessing an affair. She walked out before Lydia could force the words out the right way. Lydia said she never blamed her. She just felt the door close. I swallowed, feeling the sting of how many doors I had let close without realizing it. I thought of Miriam's face that day she saw the cards under my sink, guilt flashing like a match. I understood it better now. Lydia said Carter was the only one who believed her right away. She said he looked sick when she told him like he wanted to tear the world apart and didn't know where to start. She said he promised to help, and then Ronan tightened the leash on him until help became another form of trap. She said Carter started intercepting letters when she tried to write to me. She said he was terrified I would go after the attacker, end up dead in a ditch, or locked away in a cell, leaving no one to protect the baby. Carter shifted in the bed, eyes still closed. His hand clenched once, then let go. Lydia's voice softened when she spoke about the child. She said she knew the baby was not mine, and she knew what that meant for my heart. She said she still wanted me to be the one to decide the child's future. Not Ronan, not fear, not the men who thought they owned our lives. She said she approached an adoption attorney through a women's shelter. She said she could not finish the legal process because Ronan's people were watching, because the paperwork would lead them straight to me, and because she was running out of time. But she told the attorney to write my name on the preliminary forms anyway, not as a legal trick, but as a prayer. She said if anything happened to her, she wanted the child's file to point to me like a compass. I felt my throat close. My mind tried to picture her filling out those forms alone, hands shaking, hoping my name could protect a life I hadn't even known existed. She said she had hoped to tell me the truth herself. She said she practiced the words 100 times in her head, then watched the courage drain away every time Ronan's shadow crossed the edge of our life. She said fear kept closing the doors before she could step through. Then she went quiet for a moment. I could hear her breathing, small and ragged. When she spoke again, she said my name like she was touching something fragile. She said if I was hearing the recording, she didn't make it far enough to tell me herself. That line hit me in the ribs like a fist. My hand flew to the trackpad, not to stop the file, but because my body needed something to hold. I leaned forward and felt my forehead touch my knuckles. I was surprised by the wet heat behind my eyes. I didn't let it fall. I just breathed through it slow and shallow the way I used to on a pole when the wind was trying to peel me off the line. The audio ended. The laptop fan kept whining. The monitor beside Carter chirped on steady and indifferent. For a long time, neither of us spoke. I felt the weight of all the years I had spent silent, telling myself silence was protection. I had protected no one from grief. Not her, not the child, not myself. I had just delayed the reckoning. Carter opened his eyes finally. His voice was rougher now, like he had been pulled under water and back. He said she left one more thing. He had to rest before he could finish the sentence. I waited. The room felt filled with snowlight and old sins. He said Lydia kept a box hidden after the fire in 2000. Not in the house, somewhere safer. He said she told him to hold it until the day he knew I could handle what was inside. He said the box was tied to the fire, tied to the man who died in it, tied to Ronan's reach. He said he had kept it in a storage unit under his name, moving it twice when he thought Ronan was sniffing too close. I asked what was in it. Carter shook his head, breath wheezing. He said he never opened it. He said Lydia made him promise. His eyes filled not with tears, but with a kind of exhausted regret. He said he was tired of promises that only bought us fear. He told me the unit number, then gave me a key from his bedside drawer. His fingers brushed mine cold and light. He whispered that whatever waited in that box would hurt. He said it might also set something right. He didn't say which he feared more. When the nurse stepped back in to check his vitals, I stood and slipped the USB into my coat pocket. It felt like a small stone that had been lodged in my chest for decades and had finally fallen free into my hand. I looked at Carter on the bed, this brother who had betrayed me, and tried to save me in the same breath. I didn't know what forgiveness looked like yet. I only knew the truth was no longer a storm I could wait out. Outside the window, the snow kept falling quiet and thick, covering the parking lot in a clean white sheet that would not stay clean for long. I walked into the hallway holding that storage key like it was a fuse. And somewhere deep in me, something old lit up again. Not rage, not hope, but the steady certainty that the next door I opened was going to show me fire. The wind hit me first, sharp and colorless, carrying the kind of cold that crept under a coat, no matter how tightly it was buttoned. I stood on the courthouse steps with the box in my hands, the one Carter said Lydia left behind. Snow drifted across the parking lot in thin sheets, and inside the lobby I could already hear the low hum of voices gathering for the hearing. It was not a trial, not yet, but everyone moved as if a verdict hung in the air. The doors opened with a heavy push. Warmth brushed my face, then the smell of old wood polish and paper. A clerk nodded at me, and the soles of my shoes echoed down the hallway in uneven beats. The box felt heavier than it had in Carter's apartment. I could feel something shifting inside it, small and rigid like a bone. Stephen waited near the hearing room with a stack of files pressed against his chest. His tie was crooked, unusual for him. He watched me approach, and I saw in his eyes that he already knew this morning would change more than he could predict. "You ready, Harlan?" I said I was, though the truth sat somewhere lower beneath the ribs where breath comes short. We walked into the room together. The overhead lights were too cold, buzzing faintly, casting everyone's skin in a pale wash. Rows of chairs were filled with neighbors' reporters, and a few faces I didn't recognize. Miriam sat near the back, hands locked in her lap. When she lifted her gaze to me, it trembled and fell again. She shouldn't have been here, but she came anyway. Ronan sat at the table with 2 federal marshals on either side. His wrists were cuffed, but he held himself, as if none of this applied to him. He looked up when I entered. Something in his eyes flickered, then flattened into that same unreadable calm I'd seen in the bar decades ago. Stephen placed the files in front of us. The judge entered. The room rose. My pulse pressed hard against my neck. When we sat again, Stephen opened the box and slid the contents onto the table. The ultrasound glimmered under the lights, the original print, not the faded copy I had received the year before. A whisper rippled through the room. The prosecutor began with a summary outlining the refinancing fraud, the forged signature the woman linked to Ronan's group. I listened, but my attention held on the ultrasound, the grainy shape that never left my mind once I saw it. It was the one thing Lydia had tried to keep safe. Ronan leaned back, eyelids low, like a man tired of hearing an old story retold. Stephen stood and addressed the judge. He reached for the newspaper clipping next, the report on the apartment fire. The air thickened when he read the date, the week Ronan disappeared from Ohio, the same week Lydia tried to flee the county. He placed the clipping on the table, then the toxicology results from Lydia's medical records showing the sedatives. The judge asked Ronan if he wished to respond. He shrugged a small upward tilt of his shoulders, more dismissive than indifferent. People say many things when they're scared. His voice was smooth, almost warm, and a few people in the room shifted uncomfortably. Stephen didn't take the bait. He played the FBI audio next. The speakers crackled, then my own voice from years ago filled the room, brittle and unfamiliar. I listened to my younger self asking Ronan to leave Lydia alone, offering to pay the debt. Then Ronan's reply, low and steady, cutting through everything. Silence is what I need from you, Avery. Hearing it again made my stomach tighten. In the present, Ronan didn't flinch. The judge asked if I had anything to add. My throat tightened, but I stood. The room stilled. Even the fluorescent hum seemed to quiet. I told them about this night I found Lydia and Carter with the bank papers, about the perfume. I didn't recognize the boot prints in the snow. I told them about the years of cards, the ones that arrived like unpaid debts, and how each December I thought I could ignore them until one day I couldn't. When I spoke Lydia's name, something in me pulled tight. I kept my jaw locked, afraid if it loosened, I would lose every word I still needed. A man in the second row raised his hand. He was older, wearing a winter coat, despite the indoor heat. He said he once lived in the same building that burned. His voice shook as he explained he saw a man fleeing the scene before the flames rose. He couldn't identify the man, then not in the dark, but he'd seen him again 2 years later in a parking lot with Ronan. The room reacted like a single organism. Heads turned. Someone whispered. Ronan's expression didn't change, but his shoulders stiffened, small enough to miss if I weren't staring at him. The judge asked Miriam to step forward next. She walked slowly, the weight of something long carried dragging her steps. When she faced me, she looked older than she had an hour before. I misread her years ago, Miriam said softly. I thought her tears were something else. I should have listened. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Her voice held the grief of a woman who couldn't undo her silence. The judge turned to Ronan again, asking if he wished to speak. Ronan's smile appeared without warning, thin and sharp, the kind that made me feel the temperature drop. You're all looking in the wrong direction. He didn't raise his voice yet, every ear caught the words. Then he looked straight at me, leaning forward so the cuffs clinked softly. You still haven't asked the only question that matters. Where is the child now? The room froze. My breath stalled. For a moment, everything blurred like someone had pulled the world backward. A marshal stepped closer to Ronan, but he didn't move again. He sat back, eyes on me, waiting. Stephen whispered something at my side, but I didn't hear him. The ultrasound lay on the table between us, its edges catching the cold light. That was the point where the chapter should have ended, but the judge cleared his throat, sensing the spike in tension. We will reconvene after a recess. The gavel hit once, hard. Everyone rose chairs, scraping in staggered rhythms. People whispered, some staring at me, some at Ronan, some at the empty space where answers belonged. I didn't move. The room emptied around me. Snow drifted past the high windows, thin flakes catching the light. The ultrasound shifted slightly in the draft from the closing door. I reached out and steadied it, though I wasn't sure if I was stopping it from falling or bracing myself for what came next. And in that quiet moment, with the room hollow and the truth hanging by a thread, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost violent. The next step would break open everything. The courthouse hallway thinned out until only a few scattered voices echoed in the distance. I stood for a moment near the tall window at the end, coat folded over my arm, listening to the quiet settle, after a long day that had pushed every hidden corner of my life into the open. The lights above hummed softly. The air smelled faintly of old paper and winter coats, a familiar mix in places where truth is forced into daylight. When I stepped outside, the cold reached me before the wind did. Snow drifted in slow ribbons, touching the brim of my hair, collecting on the handle of the box I carried. I rested it on the passenger seat of my car and sat for a while watching the courthouse windows blink out one by one. It felt like watching the last pages of a heavy book close at last. The road home was quiet. Houses glowed behind curtains, warm squares of light cutting into the early night. I drove slower than usual, not because of the snow, but because my chest felt full in a way I had not known for years. When I reached the driveway, I let the engine idle a moment, then finally turned it off. The silence that followed was gentle. Inside the house felt different. Not lighter, not heavier, just honest. I set the box on the coffee table and let my coat slip onto the back of the chair. The living room had the same dim glow it always had in winter, but something in the air felt open, as if the walls were no longer bracing against secrets. I walked to the storage closet and pulled out the old string of Christmas lights. The knots in the wires had tightened over the years, and I worked them loose carefully. When I carried the lights back to the living room, the bulbs knocked softly together, a sound I had not heard since before everything went quiet. I draped the strand over the couch and stepped back, letting the room breathe. Miriam and Elliot arrived after night had fully taken the sky. I heard their car settle outside, then the steady rhythm of footsteps on the porch. When I opened the door, the warm air inside pressed out around me, and both of them paused, as if reading something in my face. Miriam touched my sleeve with a faint shake in her hand. "Are you all right?" I told her I felt steady, or as close to steady as the day would allow. They stepped inside. The lamplight brushed against their faces, catching the softened lines around Miriam's eyes and the grown resolve in Elliot's posture. We sat at the table, bowls of soup, sending thin curls of steam upward. The clink of spoons filled the quiet until I began. I told them what I had carried. All of it. The fire, the buried report, the years of cards, the last recording the meeting, the lies, the fear. The room stayed still as the truth found its way into the open. When I finished, Elliot leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice low. "I wish you had not gone through that alone." Miriam reached for my hand. She did not say sorry. She did not defend herself. There was only the warmth of her fingers closing gently around mine, And in that moment I felt the weight shift in a way words could not manage. When they stood to leave, the night had thickened into a soft curtain of white. Snowflakes drifted past the porch light like slow sparks. Elliot hugged me, his breath catching for a second against my shoulder. "Think you will host Christmas next year?" His voice held a quiet hope that felt like a small flame held between cupped hands. I nodded. "Every year, I am done running." Their taillights slipped down the street, swallowed by the dark. I stayed on the porch long enough for the cold to settle into my coat, then stepped back inside. In the living room, the lights lay where I had left them. I placed them along the mantel, guiding each bulb into place. My hands moved with the careful rhythm of someone fixing something that mattered more than he had realized. When the strand was ready, I found the switch near the window. For a moment, I simply stood there. Then I pressed it. Warm gold filled the room, rising across the walls, catching the picture frames, settling into the corners where shadows had lived too long. Outside, the snow glowed gently, as if returning the light back to me. The house felt awake again. I opened the box and lifted the last card I had written. The paper was plain, nothing ornate, but the weight of it sat deep in my palm. I placed it on the mantel beside the ultrasound that had traveled farther than I ever imagined it would. I turned the lights on Lydia. The words lay still in the soft glow, not a message to what was lost, but a marker for what remained. I stepped back and let the room settle around me. The lights hummed faintly. The air felt warmer. I moved to the armchair by the window and lowered myself into it. Outside, snow fell in a steady hush. Inside, the house breathed with me, slow and even, as if matching my rhythm for the first time in years. I had thought the end would feel heavy. Instead, it felt like a long winter, finally making room for something gentler. And there, in the quiet glow of the living room, I let myself rest. For the first time in decades, I knew I was home.